Hello and welcome to the guide to Chapter 1, The Secret of the Door from Jekyll and Hyde.
What is this feeling of power and drive I've never known? I feel alive. Where does this feeling of power derive, making me know why I'm alive? Like the night, it's a secret, sinister, dark, and unknown. I do not know what I seek, yet I'll seek it alone. I have a thirst that I cannot deprive. Never have I felt so alive. There is no battle I couldn't survive. Feeling like this, feeling alive. Like the moon, an enigma, lost and alone in the night. Damned by some heavenly stigma, but blazing with light. It's the feeling of being alive, filled with evil but truly alive. It's the truth that cannot be denied. It's a feeling of being inward hide. Wait, what's this? Sweet miss, I thought I had lost you.
This then is the GCSE guide to Jekyll and Hyde, focusing on Chapter 1. Here's a user's guide in case you haven't seen one of these videos before. Pause the video now, take a look through to see how best to use this information. We're going to focus on AO1, understanding the book, AO2, its language, form and structure, and AO3, its context. We're going to look at all the key themes in the book itself, and particularly used in this chapter. More information on that later on. What does Stevenson want us to remember about Chapter 1? Well, it's in this chapter we're first shocked at Hyde's actions and meet our narrator, Mr. Utterson. What does Stevenson tell us about Jekyll and Hyde in this particular chapter? Well, we have our first meeting with Hyde, described as a little man, trampled calmly, hellish to see, damned juggernaut, and like Satan. Stevenson confronts us with Hyde in Chapter 1, emphasising his Satan-like qualities and revealing his villain. Hyde is immediately disliked by the reader as a character who is the exact opposite of Christian and moral beliefs. He is described as being like a machine, a juggernaut, who is unstoppable and almost emotionless.
Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield are out for their usual Sunday walk in the park. These two men are distant relatives and have little in common. On this particular walk, Enfield is reminded of an incident he had been in the other night. On that night, he had encountered a man that had trampled a young girl. A crowd quickly formed and they demanded the man pay compensation to the girl for her injuries. The man agreed and proceeded to enter the warehouse, then returned with 10 British pounds in coins and a cheque for 90 pounds, which was signed by a well-known London scientist. This deformed man turned out to be Mr. Hyde. In Chapter 2,
Let's break that down then. What exactly do we learn from this chapter? Gabriel Utterson and Richard Enfield are going for a stroll as they always did on a Sunday. Enfield points out a door and tells Utterson a story. Enfield saw a man trample a young girl on a street corner. Enfield caught the man and blackmailed him to get compensation for the girl and her family. The man gets a cheque to pay the compensation and is signed by another man that Enfield knows. The man says his name is Hyde. Utterson says he can guess the name on the cheque as well and wants to know more. Stevenson fills his opening chapter with juxtaposition. He does this with his characters and their actions and reactions, immediately making clear the stark contrasts of the Victorian era.
In Chapter 1 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, on a walk one Sunday evening, Mr. Utterson, a wealthy and well-respected London lawyer, and his friend Mr. Enfield passed through a quiet London neighborhood. Enfield points out a door and relates to Utterson a story in connection with it. One evening, Enfield says, he was walking home around 3 a.m. when he saw two people in the otherwise deserted neighborhood. One was a shrunken, misshapen man walking quickly. The other was a young girl running down a cross street. They ran into each other at the corner, and the man trampled the little girl, leaving her lying there screaming. Enfield, the girl's family, and a doctor confronted the man and blackmailed him into paying £100 to the girl and her family as compensation for what he'd done. The man led them to the doorway, went inside, and returned with £10 in gold and a check for the other 90. The group suspected the check was a forgery, but the man stayed with them until the bank opened the next morning. To their surprise, the check was good and carried the name of a respected gentleman. Utterson asks some pointed questions, but Enfield responds that he hadn't investigated it. He has, however, studied the door and says there is something strange about it. It isn't clear where it leads or how many rooms are associated with what's inside. Utterson asks the name of the man who trampled the child, and Enfield tells him it was Hyde. Utterson explains why he did not ask whose name was on the check, because he already knows who it is.
Now we're going to start to break down the chapter into various extracts and explore what Stevenson does with language and form here. This then is our first description of Mr. Utterson. Stevenson makes his main character clear straight away. He's a lawyer who's got a heightened sense of right and wrong. Stevenson forces us to see Utterson as cold and unemotional, the exact opposite of Enfield. He hates talking and is seen as boring, yet this is juxtaposed by the fact he's lovable and liked. Stevenson deliberately uses the adjectival phrase eminently human to make clear that Utterson is symbolic of the human race, filled with emotion. This later contrasts with the machine-like Hyde. Stevenson forces us to reflect on Utterson's hidden life, a man who drinks gin, a cheap alcohol that would desensitize him to the finer things in life. Gin was a very popular drink in Victorian England. See my video on Stevenson's life for more information. Utterson is trustworthy, kind and a tolerant man who is inclined to help, implying his strong Christian nature. Some information on Utterson, our first key character. You can see in red some interesting points to make about him. He's serious, social awkward and unprejudiced, and underneath you can see the evidence to justify those points. Let's have a close look at his name, Mr. Gabriel Utterson. His name is a morpheme. Utter means to speak, and which is ironic as he really doesn't like to. The second meaning has a sense of complete, as in utter devastation, yet this is a man who is completely restrained and won't give in to the vices that Jekyll does. The third meaning could imply chattiness or rumour spreading. In this case, he is Utter's son, implying he is the victim of Enfield's chatting and storytelling. We also have his first name, Gabriel. This is the name of an angel, the messenger angel.
The archangel Gabriel is known as the Lord's messenger. The name Gabriel means man of God or emissary of God. The angel Gabriel is certainly one of the most well-known angelic figures, along with the archangels Raphael and Michael, and the fallen angel Lucifer. His most noteworthy appearance clearly took place when he announced the birth of the Son of God. The angel Gabriel was sent by God to Galilee to conduct the noblest mission of all. He would announce to the Virgin Mary that she would receive the grace of conceiving the Highness's son. At first, Mary felt frightened, but the archangel reassured her and revealed God's will. This unborn baby would soon be named Jesus. Even though this is the most renowned biblical episode in which Gabriel is present, there are other moments where the angel of Annunciation showed his character. The angel appeared before the prophet Daniel to announce the Messiah's coming. Likewise, he also stood before Zechariah the priest, announcing the arrival of his son John the Baptist. Zechariah doubted Gabriel, and so he remained speechless until the birth of his son. According to the biblical texts, the Archangel Gabriel affirms that he is always in God's presence, and that he serves him to announce the good news. For this reason, those who believe in these heavenly figures and are devoted to them pray to and ask the angel to disclose the good news and God's promises for their life.
Does this mean then that Stevenson intended Utterson to be God's voice in the narrative? Or is it simply Utterson, an angelic presence, representing God's sphere into what mankind is devolving into? It's up to you to decide. The second key character we meet as he begins to tell the story of Hyde is Mr. Richard Enfield. Once more, some key points about the character and quotes about him underneath. It is then Enfield who tells the story of his first encounter with Hyde. All at once I saw two figures. Stevenson presents us with a factual account of the incident, leaving us to read it like a news report. Stevenson repeatedly infers Hyde's devilish qualities: little, horrible, trampled. This directly challenges us to see Hyde as ungodly. Stevenson uses the oxymoron trampled calmly to emphasise the horrific nature of Hyde's actions. This isn't just violence, but a man who isn't governed by emotion. Stevenson forces us to reflect on Hyde's machine-like qualities to suggest he's unstoppable, perhaps foreshadowing his future actions and the effect of industry on Victorian life. Stevenson deliberately calls the Doctor, an educated man, a sawbones, a slang term which implies a similar sense of brutal violence, another symbol of the brutality in the most educated of men. In Victorian times, even the doctors were more like torturers.
Don't worry, Jenny, okay? I've called an ambulance. They'll be here any minute.
Make way! Historical paramedics.
You're paramedics.
Even better, we're historical paramedics.
All the way from Victorian England. God save the Queen!
God save the Queen!
Now, what appears to be the ailment?
Okay, well, it's my sister. We were just coming back from town and she's just collapsed with these terrible stomach pains.
Are you thinking what I'm thinking?
The top hats are fabulous.
No, they are. I'm thinking that this lady has tapeworm.
I concur. Nigel, fetch me our sharpest blade.
What, you need to operate?
No, I simply need to cut up this bacon and then fry it in close proximity to the patient. The smell of the bacon should tempt the tapeworm out of her stomach because it wants to eat the bacon, thus curing the patient.
And does this bacon cure work?
Infrequently.
How infrequently?
Never!
Jeff, look. She has some inflammation about the throat. Looks like a boil.
I concur. Nigel, apply the warm porridge.
It's not a boil. She's always had that.
A wart, then? Nigel, this lady, this woman, is riddled with warts. Bury some string in the ground immediately.
It's not a wart. It's a birthmark.
Is it? Hang on. I hear wheezing and congestion.
Yeah, well, she's got a cold.
A cold? Nigel, fetch me a sock.
A sock.
Don't worry, sir. A sweaty sock tied about the throat is thought to be the best cure for even the most persistent of colds. And that one is really sweaty. I only change them once a week in case they're needed.
Sugar.
Treacle?
Sugar and treacle is an excellent cure for a cough. Mixed, of course, with beer, rum, and vinegar.
Open up.
Get it down, you go.
In there.
What about the stomach pains?
Does your tummy still hurt?
Oh, looks like earache.
Nigel, fetch me a potato.
What potato?
The topical application of a potato makes an excellent cure for earache. There we are, right as rain.
No need to thank us, sir. Your smile is thanks enough.
Uh-oh. That sounds like a proper ambulance.
Soon they will be upon us. We must flee this place.
Run away! Run away! Run away!
Hop away.
Oh no, those historical ones have been here again. Jane, bring some sponges. Oh, and maybe a pan. I think there's some bacon going.
You can imagine what they might do with a broken bone. Saw it straight off. These were university-educated doctors the nation depended on. At this point, of course, we've begun to experience the evil of Hyde. He's defensive, deformed, machine-like, abnormal, fiery, animalistic, vicious, parasitic, tempting, impulsive. Have a look at the quotes underneath that justify these points. The trampling of the girl is graphically and hideously violent, so much so that most film versions leave this scene out entirely. It is a metaphor for the destruction of innocence and religion by the darker side of society, industry and science. Stevenson explores the effect of Victorian society through his first depiction of Hyde's actions, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. The oxymoron trampled calmly confronts us with the deliberate attitude of Hyde in his actions and his lack of emotion. This is not a crime of aggression or revenge, but simply a result of Hyde's careless attitude towards other life. We then have Enfield trying to describe Hyde, as Utterson is obviously curious. Stevenson deliberately makes it unclear how Hyde looks, cleverly leaving it up to the readers to imagine him. Stevenson deliberately uses plosives to emphasise the disgust that Enfield feels. Displeasing, detestable, deformed, deformity is repeated to imply how inhuman Hyde looks. Disability was seen as disgusting to the Victorians and a sign of the devil. Stevenson once again describes Hyde as unnatural, hyperbolizing the traits described previously. Stevenson confronts us with the image of a man who is more than human, an embodiment of the devil, almost supernatural in his evil appearance. We're now going to look then at the key themes in Jekyll and Hyde as they feature in Chapter 1. First up, we have a description of setting. The opening description of London is filled with contrasts between bright, the rich, opulent side of London compared with its dark industrial quarters. Juxtaposition is frequently used. The street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighbourhood. The brightness of the street in which Utterson and Enfield walk down is almost biblical, a fire in a forest. This implies the extreme goodness of Utterson and the rich half of London itself. This goodness is made clear through the semantic field surplus, smiling, shone, fresh, and well polished. There are others to find too. Here's a little map then of the street that's being described. We have Utterson and Enfield walking along a fancy street, but they suddenly come across this sinister block of a building, implying then that this is like a wart or a boil on the face of a beautiful city. Stevenson uses Gothic fictions to tap a vein of Victorian anxiety about the perilously narrow line between civilization and barbarism. There's very little distance between the fancy area of London and this sinister block. The two houses coexist on the same street. Hyde's house is clearly personified. Blind forehead, sordid, blistered and disdained. The violent plosive b sound in block of building, blind, blistered, adds to the violence of its owner. The adjective blind implies disability, similar to the way that Hyde is described, because it may imply that Jekyll, the owner of the house, is blind to what Hyde represents, the deformity of Jekyll's own soul. The theme of friendship, obviously present as Utterson and Enfield are great friends. Stevenson juxtaposes the introvert, Utterson, with the extrovert, Enfield, to make and that's made clear in this chapter. We have Utterson, who finds it difficult in discourse and finds it hard to socialise. And then we have Enfield, a man about town, who is in every way Utterson's opposite. The two men said nothing, so don't easily fit, yet they have a bond that can't be broken. Utterson makes friends based on how long he's known them, and that is what drives his need to find out the connection between Hyde and Jekyll. A quote then, "It was a nut to crack for many to describe their relationship," is a metaphor, and the metaphor of nut is used to describe the relationship between Enfield and Utterson. It implies to us that no one understands the bond between the two men and helps us understand why Utterson is so determined to get to the bottom of the relationship between Jekyll and Hyde. Utterson's goodness drives him to help those who he's decided to be friends with, no matter what. The theme of repression. Stevenson's first chapter is filled with repression. Utterson is seemingly upper class, yet drinks gin that destroys his sense of luxury. Utterson likes the theatre but won't actually go there. The crowd attempted to be violent against Hyde. Their inhibitions then, or their violent, darker natures are coming to the fore as soon as they see this man. The crowd fear the working class and their sinful behaviour. That's perhaps why they react so badly to Hyde, a man who's clearly working class. Utterson is uneasy about the apparent ease of Jekyll's back passage to Hyde, a link to the anti-homosexuality views of the time. Utterson then says, a man doesn't walk in real life, walk into a cellar door and come out of it for close to £100. The disbelief of Enfield said the quote, is clear as he describes Hyde's entrance into the block. It implies a sexual interaction between Jekyll and Hyde that is known in society but not talked about. The amount of money seems unbelievable to both men without some kind of misconduct or blackmail. The description of the house as a person further amplifies the insinuation of homosexuality in the relationship between Jekyll and Hyde. Homosexuality was made illegal in 1885, so many innocent, good citizens had to find ways just to be themselves. Drag, acting, or mutilation were common ways in which men attempted to be more feminine so they could be homosexual. Homosexuality was uncivilized and ungodly in Victorian England, and everyone suspected everyone else of having that secret side to themselves. Gross indecency would lead to a time in prison. The relationship between Hyde and Jekyll could easily be seen as indecent. The personification of the house leads to suspect, along with Hyde's apparent ease of access to Dr. Jekyll's back passage. The Victorians had a growing fear of the urban working class and their unbridled pursuit of sexual pleasure. Remember, the working class did not have to obey the rules of being a gentleman. They weren't interested in being respectable, so they were able to behave a lot more freely than a respectable gentleman would be able to. The theme of religion. Stevenson's juxtaposition of heaven and hell is made clear in chapter 1. We have Utterson, named after the angel Gabriel and simply a good Christian man. The Satan-like Hyde, who's directly contrasted to his using sinful behaviour. And the young girl who's trampled, a symbol of innocence and purity. The fact the start of Hyde's story is told on a Sunday, the Christian day of rest and relaxation. And Hyde is a juggernaut, implying the willful destruction of death and Christianity as a powerful force rolls over the person's beliefs. Utterson says, I am inclined to Cain's heresy. This is a reference to Genesis chapter 4 when Cain murders his brother. Cain is unable to control himself and is jealousy of others, so perhaps Utterson is scared of his own demons and is fighting to control them.
After the fall, God banished Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. Life was hard. Work was difficult, but God promised Eve that she would give birth to her own children. And soon it happened. Eve gave birth to a son and called him Cain. Cain was the firstborn. Then she had a second son and named him Abel. As the boys grew up, they showed interest in different things. Abel loved animals and became a shepherd. Cain, on the other hand, became a farmer and was growing plants and food for the family. Both Cain and Abel were supposed to pray to God and thank him for his provision. Abel loved God, and it showed by his beautiful offer he brought. He gave God his best sheep as a sacrifice. Cain brought some of his crop, probably not even his best, and God loved Abel's offering more. When Cain saw this, he became very jealous and angry. God seemed to like Abel more than he did Cain, and this stirred up more hatred in Cain's heart. One day, Cain told Abel that they should go out into the field. Cain's heart was wicked, and his jealousy made him do a very foolish thing. He planned to hurt Abel. He planned to kill his own brother. While in the field, Cain fought with his brother and killed him. Cain's jealousy turned his anger into rage, and in a foolish act, he murdered his own flesh and blood. Cain forgot that God knew everything, even that which he did in secret. Now Cain was really in trouble. God spoke to Cain. "Cain, where is Abel your brother?" Cain was scared. Did God know? "I don't know," Cain lied to God. "Am I supposed to guard my brother all the time?" God was not fooled. "What have you done? I know that you've killed your brother, Abel." God then cursed Cain and banished him. No longer would Cain be able to plant and harvest any crops, no matter how hard he worked. Even in this punishment, God protected Cain by placing a special mark on him. This mark meant that anyone who killed Cain would be severely punished. From that day on, Cain became a fugitive on the earth, settling in the land of Nod, far from the garden and far from God's pleasure. Cain's punishment would last the rest of his life.
Perhaps Stevenson is implying here that Utterson is just as weak as Jekyll. Utterson has a darker side, but he's not willing to submit to it just yet, just as Cain did. Theme of science. The theme of science is only subtly hinted at in Chapter 1. Hyde is a little man which begins to suggest his ape-like qualities later on. But the main man of science in this chapter, the Doctor or the Sawbones, is described as having a desire to kill, implying that even the most educated men are still servants to their barbaric instincts. The theme of violence. Hyde's controlled violence has already been covered, as the oxymoron "trampled calmly" implies a detached, unemotional destruction of innocence, which challenges us to see Hyde as pure evil. Yet the crowd's reaction is equally sinister and unreserved. The Doctor turns sick and white with a desire to kill Hyde, which implies the violence under the surface of the most educated men. The rest of the crowd are wild as harpies, who are monstrous creatures of legend who are evil messengers of the devil. Hyde and the crowd's behaviour and actions suggest that Stevenson wants to see society as malcontent, dissatisfied with what life offers, and rebellious against the social rule we must follow. The most obvious example is the Doctor, who's sworn to save lives but wants now to kill. Some key quotes then from this chapter. What does Stevenson want us to think at the end of this chapter? Stevenson fills his opening chapter with mystery and suspense. We're challenged by an unspeakably horrific event and a cold, calculated criminal. We are not yet allowed to picture Hyde, instead using our imaginations. The chapter is filled with Gothic conventions to entice us into the mystery. Here then is a one-screen adaptation then of the thoughts and ideas in this chapter. From the outset we are confronted by a story of Gothic intrigue. Now we're going to move on to essay skills then. How would you use these answers or these ideas in an essay on Jekyll and Hyde? I'm going to use the essay plan I'll use for any essay. We start with a short overview, then we write about the start of the story, what's changed by the middle, and what's changed by the end. I'm going to cover the question, how is the theme of violence explored in Jekyll and Hyde? This is a possible extract you could be given in the test then.
Figures, one a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other a girl of maybe 8 or 10, who was running as hard as she was able down a cross street. Well, sir, the two ran into one another, naturally enough, at the corner, and then came the horror calmly over the girl's body, and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man, it was like some damned juggernaut. I gave a view hallo, took to my heels, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group about the screaming child. He was perfectly cool and made no resistance, but gave me one look so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. The people who'd turned out with a sweat on me like running. The people who'd turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor for whom she'd been sent put in his appearance. Well, the child was not much the worse, more frightened, according to the Sawbones, and there you might have supposed would be an end to it, to the Sawbones, and there you might have supposed would be an end to it. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight. So had the child's family, which was only natural. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He was natural. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut-and-dry apothecary, of no particular age and colour, with a strong Edinburgh accent, and about as emotional as...
I now need to think about which quotes are the best ones, and which ones I want to analyse in some detail. Remember, the extract is chosen linked to the question set, so a lot of your response will come from the extract without relying on quotes you've memorised. We know the extract comes from the beginning of the book. We know it foreshadows events later in the book. We need to show the examiner that we understand that. The overview then of this extract would read as follows. The extract is vital as it helps us understand the effect Hyde has on others as decent men are disturbed by Hyde's destruction and physical appearance. Now I begin selecting the quotes I want to use. All the quotes I could use are highlighted in either red or green, with the red ones being the ones I'd want to use in quite short answers, and the green ones being those that I might want to analyse in more detail. It's important that I try and show off everything I can say about the extract, but also prove I can zoom in on particular details. Remember, I'm graded in 3 ways: knowledge of the book, use of language, and context. This is then how my answer might read. As you can see, the bits in red are where I've given fairly short answers using quotes. The bits in green is where I've chosen to analyse using the quotes already listed in the various colours. Please pause the video to read this example through. You can see that at the beginning I've thought about the whole opening and summed it up into a sentence. I then take the first quote and explain it in one sentence, ensuring that I've explained the point made using the word because. I've then used a green quote where I zoom in on a particular word and then be careful how I explain it. I must stick to exactly what the word means, otherwise it isn't analysis. So I had to look really closely in this case at the phrase trampled calmly, rather than making just a general point about Hyde himself. Then I go on to look at more short quotes in red before analysing another quote at the end of my response. The quotes now, or the sentences in pink/purple, are the key phrases I might want to use in my response. So we've got from the outset, Hyde represents, to confront us with, challenges us to, and suggests to us, all imply a sense of inference or evaluation of the text given. Remember, I'm graded in 3 ways. I've highlighted now where I've used context in my response. I've linked to the Victorians, I've looked at what Victorian society was like, and I've looked at illness and Stevenson's own life at the bottom. Thank you very much then for listening to this guide to Jekyll and Hyde, Chapter 1.